Alright, so let's dive right into this topic. I'm really not sure how the things that I would like to say will come out, if they'll come out at all during this video, but let's just dive right in. Okay, so I think that everyone who is a consenting adult should know what they are comfortable with sexually speaking and what they are uncomfortable with sexually speaking. Personally, I do not engage in any sort of anal sex or anal play, mainly for the extra health risks that are involved. I can't claim any religious beliefs hindering why I'm not into these or all sexual acts beyond what I've just stated, because I'm not religious. Now, I started investigating this topic of homosexuality in Saudi after I was intimate with a Saudi guy. We did not have penetrative sex because he did not have protection with him. And during the time that we were together, he seemed to place a lot of emphasis on like anal pleasure, being like anal lingus, is that a word? And not really touching like any other areas that would seem obvious to touch. Now this could be due to the sort of societal stigma attached to chastity and premarital sex. I've kept that in mind. However, at some point he seemed to like maybe roll over on his belly, kind of as if to say like, now it's my turn. And in hindsight, I do kind of jokingly remember him saying, I don't remember the context, something like, you will eat me, or haha, will you eat me? And I just kind of like didn't really respond to it, maybe like put a like laughing emoji or something like that. I didn't really take it seriously because we were just getting to know each other, and I'm like, surely he doesn't mean that. I'm sorry, I can't remember the context, and I have not kept the messages, so I can't check the receipts. Anyway, so after that sort of passive engagement with this man, I started to think, well, maybe it could be possible that he has engaged in homosexual sex before, just based on the overall sexual energy that I was getting from that coupling between us. Okay, and I found a really interesting article written by, let's see, what's her name? Nadia Lambie. And I'll be reading that. After I read that, I'll be talking about sort of the homosexual sort of engagements throughout the society that I've noticed. Some being at the university, some just being in my residential areas and things like that. And then I'll maybe just discuss a few other incidents. I'll also be discussing this very interesting disciplinary action that's been taken against some of the students at the university that I work at who have very short boys' haircuts. Okay, so this is kind of a long read. I'll try to read as quickly as possible. The good thing though is that it's relatively interesting. So this article was written for The Atlantic. It's called The Kingdom in the Closet. Written again by Nadia Lambie almost 11 years ago. The Kingdom in the Closet. Sodomy is punishable by death in Saudi Arabia, but gay life flourishes there. Why is it easier to be gay than straight in a society where everyone, homosexual and otherwise, lives in the closet? Yasser, a 26-year-old artist, was taking me on an impromptu tour of his hometown in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, on a sweltering September afternoon. The air conditioner of his dusty Honda battled the heat. Prayer beads dangled from the rearview mirror, and the smell of the cigarette he just smoked wafted towards me as he stopped to show me a barber shop that his friends frequent. Officially, men in Saudi Arabia aren't allowed to wear their hair long or to display jewelry. Such vanities are usually deemed to violate an Islamic instruction that the sexes must not be too similar in appearance. But Yasser wears a silver necklace, a silver bracelet, and a sparkly red stud in his left ear, and his hair is shaggy. Yasser is homosexual, or so we would describe him in the West, and the barber shop we visited caters to gay men. Business is brisk. Leaving the barber shop, we drove onto Tahliha Street, a broad avenue framed by palm trees, then went past a succession of sleek malls and slowed in front of a glass and steel shopping center. Men congregated outside and in nearby cafes, whereas most establishments have a family section. Two of this area's cafes allow only men. Not surprisingly, they are popular among men who prefer one another's company. Yasser gestured to the parking lot across from the shopping center, explaining that after midnight it would be full of men picking up men. These days, he said, you see gay people everywhere. Yasser turned onto a side street, then braked suddenly. Oh shit, it's a checkpoint, he said, inclining his head towards some traffic cops in brown uniforms. Do you have your ID? He asked me. He wasn't worried about the gay-themed nature of his tour. He didn't want to be caught alone with a woman. I rummaged through my purse, realizing that I'd left my passport in the hotel for safekeeping. Yasser looked behind him to see if he could reverse the car, but had no choice except to proceed. To his relief, the cops nodded us through. God, that freaked me out, Yasser said, as he resumed his narration. I recalled something he had told me earlier. It's a lot easier to be gay than straight here, he had said. If you go out with a girl, people will start to ask questions. But if you have a date upstairs and my family is downstairs, they won't come up. Notorious for its adherence to Wahhabism, a puritanical strain of Islam, and as the birthplace of most of the 9/11 hijackers, Saudi Arabia is the only Arab country that claims Sharia or Islamic law as its sole legal code. The list of prohibitions is long. It's haram, forbidden, to smoke, drink, go to discos, or mix with an unrelated person of the opposite gender. The rules are enforced by the Matawa, religious authorities employed by the government's Committee for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. By the way, shortly after I arrived in Saudi Arabia around January 2016, the Mutawa the religious police, they lost their ability to arrest people. Okay? The kingdom is dominated by mosques and malls, which the Mutawa patrol in leather sandals and shortened versions of the thobe, the traditional ankle-length white robe that many Saudis wear. Some Mutawan even bear marks of their devotion on their faces. They bow to God so adamantly that pressing their foreheads against the ground leaves a visible dent. That's also something that you'll see in Egypt. When I went to Egypt, I was a little shocked and confused at first, and then I realized what it was. I think it's sort of a farcical way to show your devotion to Allah and the religion. It's almost to say that I bow my head in prayer so much that I've scarred my forehead. Like you'll see people with like dark black marks on their forehead The Mutawwid, proud shoppers to say their devotions when the shops close for prayer several times daily. If they catch a boy and a girl on a date, they might haul the couple to the police station. They make sure that single men steer clear of the malls, which are family-only zones for the most part, unless they are with a female relative. Though the power of the Mutawwid has been curtailed recently, their presence still inspires fear. In Saudi Arabia, sodomy is punishable by death, though that penalty is seldom applied. Just this February, a man in the Mecca region was executed for having sex with a boy, among other crimes. For this reason, the names of most people in the story have been changed. Ask many Saudis about homosexuality, and they'll wince with repugnance. I disapprove. Rania, a 32-year-old human resources manager, told me firmly, women weren't meant to be with men. Women weren't meant to be with women, and men aren't supposed to be with men. This legal and public condemnation notwithstanding, the kingdom leaves considerable space for homosexual behavior. As long as gays and lesbians maintain a public front of obeisance to Wahhabist norms, they are left to do what they want in private. Vibrant communities of men who enjoy sex with other men can be found in cosmopolitan cities like Jeddah and Riyadh. They meet in schools, in cafes, in the streets, and on the internet. You can be cruised anywhere in Saudi Arabia at any time of the day, said Radwan, a 42-year-old gay Saudi American who grew up in various Western cities and now lives in Jeddah. They're quite shameless about it. Talal, a Syrian who moved to Riyadh in 2000, calls the Saudi capital a gay heaven. This is surprising enough, but what seems more startling, at least from a Western perspective, is that some of the men having sex with other men don't consider themselves gay. For many Saudis, the fact that a man has sex with another man has little to do with gayness. The acts may fulfill a desire or a need, but it doesn't constitute an identity, nor does it strip a man of his masculinity as long as he is in the top or active role. This attitude gives Saudi men who engage in homosexual behavior a degree of freedom, but is a more westernized notion of gayness, a notion that stresses orientation over acts, takes hold in the country. Will this delicate balance survive? Part 2, they will seduce you. When Yasser hit puberty, he grew attracted to his male cousins. Like many gay and lesbian teenagers everywhere, he felt isolated. I used to have the feeling that I was the queerest in the country, he recalled, but then I went to high school and discovered there are others like me. Then I find out it's a whole society. This society thrives just below the surface. During the afternoon, traffic cops patrol outside girls' schools as classes end, in part to keep boys away. But they exert little control over what goes on inside. A few years ago, a Jeddah-based newspaper ran a story on lesbianism in high schools, reporting that girls were having sex in the bathrooms. Yasmin, a 21-year-old student in Riyadh who'd had a brief sexual relationship with a girlfriend and was the only Saudi woman who'd had a lesbian relationship who was willing to speak with me for the story, told me that one of the department buildings at her college is known as a lesbian enclave. The building has large bathroom stalls, which provide privacy, and walls covered with graffiti offering romantic and religious advice. Tips include, she doesn't really love you no matter what she tells you, and before you engage in anything with her, remember, God is watching you. In Saudi Arabia, it's easier to be a lesbian than a heterosexual. There's an overwhelming number of people who turn to lesbianism, Yasmin said, adding that the number of men in the kingdom who turn to gay sex is even greater. They're not really homosexual, they said. They're like cellmates in prison. She said, rather. This analogy came up again and again during my conversations. As Radwan, the Saudi American, put it, some Saudi men can't have sex with women, so they have sex with guys. When the sexes are so strictly segregated, men are allowed little contact with women outside their families in order to protect women's purity. How do they have a chance to have sex with a woman and not get into trouble? Tariq, a 24-year-old in the travel industry, explained that many tops are simply hard up for sex, looking to break their abstinence in whatever way they can. Francis, a 34-year-old beauty queen from the Philippines. In 2003, he won a gay beauty pageant held in a private house in Jeddah by a group of Filipinos. Reported that he's had sex with Saudi men whose wives were pregnant or menstruating. When those circumstances changed, most of the men stopped calling. If they can't use their wives, Francis said, they have this option with gays. Gay courting in the kingdom is often overt. In fact, the preferred mode is cruising. When I was new here, I was worried when 6 or 7 cars would follow me as I walked down the street. Jamie, a 31-year-old Filipino florist living in Jeddah, told me. Especially if you're pretty like me. They won't stop chasing you. John Bradley, the author of Saudi Arabia Exposed, Inside a Kingdom in Crisis, 2005, says the most male Western expatriates here, gay or not, have been propositioned by Saudi men driving by at any time of the day or night, quite openly and usually very, very persistently. Many gay expatriates say they feel more at home in the kingdom than in their native lands. I have heard similar such things. For example, like a gay male teacher commenting that in all of the days that he spent in his own country, he hasn't gotten as much sex as he's gotten since he moved to Saudi Arabia. Okay, so Jason, a South African educator who has lived in Jeddah since 2002, notes that although South Africa allows gay marriage, it's as though there are more gays here. For Talal, Riyadh became an escape. When he was 17 and living in Damascus, his father walked in on him having sex with a male friend. He hit Talal and grounded him for 2 months, letting him out of the house only after he swore he was no longer attracted to men. Talal's pale face flushed crimson as he recalled his shame at disappointing his family. Eager to escape the weight of their expectations, he took a job in Riyadh. When he announced that he would be moving, his father responded, "You know all Saudis like boys, and you are white. Take care." Talal was pleased to find a measure of truth in his father's warning. His fair skin made him a hit among the locals. Marcos, a 40-year-old from the Philippines, was arrested in 1966 for attending a party featuring a drag show. He spent 9 months in prison, where he got 200 lashes before being deported. Still, he opted to return. He loves his work in fashion, which pays decently, and the social opportunities are an added bonus. Guys romp around and parade in front of you. He told me, they will seduce you. It's up to you how many you want every day. The next section is Gulf Arab love. One evening in Jeddah after a sandstorm, I sat in the glass rotunda of a cafe on Taliha Street. I spent many nights there interviewing men who were too nervous about being caught with a woman to invite me to their apartments. In a country with no cinemas or clubs or bars, The family sections of cafes and restaurants are popular dating haunts. And during my time in Saudi Arabia, I saw many heterosexual couples talking quietly together while the girl's cover, her girlfriends, sat nearby. On this occasion, I was accompanied by Miss Fear, 34, who was showing me how to navigate Paltalk, a website similar to the one where he met his boyfriend 3.5 years ago. Miss Fear told me that bottoms, men willing to be penetrated, are in short supply, and he advised me that if I wanted to generate responses to my postings, I should come up with a screen name that hinted at such willingness. We settled on Jedbutt, and I logged on to the Gulf Arab Love chat room, introducing myself as Bottom. Within minutes, I had more admirers than I could handle. They dispensed with small talk, asking for my ASL, age, size, and location, without preamble. Jeddah by the Sea cited his private dimensions and sent electronic nudges when I was slow to respond. Jet Built pressed me to continue the conversation by phone, but I was distracted by the flirty attentions of Jet to Heart. However, Jet to Heart's tone changed when I revealed I was a journalist. Jet to Heart, I lie. Jet Butt, who do you lie to? Jet to Heart, I lie in my work, with my family, but I'm gay. I can't say I'm gay. Jet Butt, is that hard to lie? Do you tell people you like women? Jet to Heart, that's why I lie. Jet Butt, what do you think your family will do if they find out? Jet to Heart, yes. Jet Butt, are you married? Jet to Heart, oh, I think I will kill myself. He went on to write that he kept his sexual preference secret from just about everyone, including his wife for 5 years. Back in Gulf Arab Love the next day, I encountered Anajed Top, who said he liked both men and women. He too was married. I told him I was a journalist, and we chatted for a bit. I asked him if we could meet. He was hesitant, but he seemed curious to find out whether I was for real. We arranged to get together that evening at the Starbucks on Tahliya Street. I waited for him in the family section, which opens out onto the mall and is surrounded by a screen of plants. A mall guard patrolled just outside. At first, Jed Top avoided my eyes, directing his comments to my male interpreter. I went in the chat room to get an idea of the bad people in those rooms so that God will keep me away from those kinds of things, he said, his leg jiggling nervously. He abandoned this weak cover story as our conversation progressed. He claimed to prefer women, though he admitted that few women frequent the Gulf Arab Love chat room. In the absence of women, he said, he'd go with a guy. I go in and put up an offer, he said. I set the tone. I'm in control. To be in control for Anajed Top meant to be on top. It's not in my nature to be a bottom, he said. I asked him whether he was gay, and he responded, no. A gay is against the norm. Anybody can be a top, but only a gay can be a bottom, he added. The worst thing is to be a bottom. The call to prayer sounded over a loudspeaker, and his leg began shaking more insistently. He put a hand on his knee in a futile attempt to steal it. The guard hovered. I'm worried the Mutawa might come, Jed Top said, and rushed off to catch the evening prayer. In The History of Sexuality, a multi-volume work published in the 1970s and 80s, Michael Foucault proposed his famous thesis that Western academic, medical, and political discourse of the 18th and 19th centuries have produced the idea of the homosexual as a deviant type. In Western society, homosexuality changed from being a behavior, what you do, to an identity, who you are. In the Middle East, however, homosexual behavior remained just that, an act, not an orientation. That is not to say that Middle Eastern men who had sex with other men were freely tolerated, but they were not automatically labeled deviant. The taxonomy revolved around the roles of top and bottom. with little stigma attaching to the top. Sexuality is distinguished not between homosexual and heterosexual, but between taking pleasure and submitting to someone, being used for pleasure. The sociologist Stephen O. Murray explains in the 1997 compilation, Islamic Homosexualities, Culture, History, and Literature. Being a bottom was shameful because it meant playing a woman's role. A bottom was not locked into his inferior status. However, he could, and was expected to, leave the role behind as he grew older. There may be a man, and he likes boys. The Saudis just look at this as, he doesn't like football. Dave, a gay American teacher who first moved to Saudi Arabia in 1978, told me, it's assumed that he is, as it were, the dominant partner playing the man's role, and there is no shame attached to it, nor is a dominant partner considered gay. However, much this may seem like sophistry, it is in keeping with the long-standing Muslim tradition of accommodating homosexual impulses, if not homosexual identity. In 19th century Iran, a young beardless adolescent was considered an object of beauty, desired by man who would grow naturally into an older bearded man who desired youthful males. There, as in much of the Islamic world, sexual practices were not considered fixed into lifelong patterns of sexual orientation. As Afsaneh Najmbadi, demonstrates in her 2005 book, Women with Mustaches and Men Without Beards, Gender and Sexual Anxieties of Iranian Modernity. A man was expected to marry, and as long as he fulfilled his procreative obligations, the community didn't probe his extracurricular activities. A magazine editor in Jeddah told me that many boys in Mecca, where he grew up, have sexual relations with men, but they don't see themselves as gay. Abu Bakr Bagadir, a human rights activist based in Jeddah, explained that homosexuality can be viewed as a phase. Homosexuality is considered something one might pass by, he said. It's to be understood as a stage of life, particularly at youth. This view of sexual behavior, in combination with the strict segregation of the sexes, serves to foster homosexual acts, shifting the stigma onto bottoms and allowing older men to excuse their younger behavior, their time as bottoms, as mere youthful transgressions. In Islamic homosexualities, the anthropologist Will Roscoe shows that this status-differentiated pattern whereby it's okay to be a top but not a bottom has its roots in Greco-Roman culture, and he emphasizes that the top-bottom power dynamic is commonly expressed in relations between older men and younger boys. Yasmin, the student who told me about the lesbian enclave at college, said that her 16-year-old brother, along with many boys his age, have been targeted by his male elders as a sexual object. It's the land of sand and sodomites, she said. The older men take advantage of the little boys. Dave, the American educator, puts it this way. Let's say there's a group of men sitting around in a cafe. If a smooth-faced boy walks by, they all stop and make approving comments. They're just noting, that's a hot little number. The next section is titled The People of Lot. Yet a paradox exists at the heart of Saudi conceptions of gay sex and sexual identity. Despite their seemingly flexible view of sexuality, most of the Saudis I interviewed, including those men who identify themselves as gay, consider sodomy a grave sin. During Ramadan, my Jeddah tour guide, Yasser, abstains from sex. His sense of propriety is widely shared. Few gay parties occur in the country during the holy month. Faith is a huge confusion for gay Muslims, Yasser and others told me. My religion says it's forbidden, and to practice this kind of activity you'll end up in hell, he explains. But Yasser places hope in God's merciful nature. God forgives you if from the inside you are very pure, he said. If you have guilt all the time while you're doing this stuff, maybe God might forgive you. If you practice something forbidden and keep it quiet, God might forgive you. Zahar, a 41-year-old Saudi who has traveled widely throughout the world, urged me not to write about Islam and homosexuality. To do so, he said, is to cut off debate, because it's always the religion that holds people back, he added. The original points of Islam can never be changed. Years ago, Zahar went to the library to ascertain just what those points are. What he found surprised him. Strange enough, there is no certain condemnation for that homosexual act in Islam. On the other hand, to have illegal sex between a man and a woman, there are very clear rules and sub-rules. Indeed, the Quran does not contain rules about homosexuality, says Everett K. Rawson, a professor at New York University who is working on a book about homosexuality in medieval Islamic society. The only passages that deal with the subject unambiguously appear in the passages dealing with Lot. The story of Lot is rendered in the Quran much as it is in the Old Testament. The man of Lot's town lusts after male angels under his protection, and he begs them to have sex with his virgin daughters instead. Okay, I just want to take a moment to sort of tell a little anecdotal story. How do I say this? I have a coworker here who's a very devout Islamic woman. She's American, she's black, and she's very gay. She's what you might refer to as a butchy type gay woman. I don't know what the non-offensive way to say that would be, but it's really funny because as gay as she is, she's like one of the hugest hypocrites I've ever seen. And I find humor in it. I mean, if you can't find humor in life, you won't last. She's touched me inappropriately twice. The first time I gave her the benefit of the doubt. The second time I was like, wow, for sure. She's got deeply rooted problems. But I like to kid with people. At one point she was joking about how I wasn't going to be able to go out and meet people, a guy in particular, long story. She's like, oh, ha ha ha, are you going out with your boyfriend, ha ha ha? And I said something like, which one? And she had the gall to say, if you have more than one boyfriend, then you're a slut, or something like that. And I'm just like, not believing that this gay Islamic woman who's a butchy woman at that is trying to place such a harsh judgment on me. I mean, but it happens across the board. I know that everyone can probably think of a person who sort of fits that behavioral mold. Anyway, back to this. Let's see. We were reading about Lot. Okay. Do ye commit lewdness, such as no people in creation ever committed before you? For ye practice your lusts on men in preference to women. Ye are indeed a people transgressing beyond bounds. The men refuse to heed him and are punished by a shower of brimstone. Their defiance survives linguistically. In Arabic, the top sodomite is luti, meaning of the people of Lot. This surely suggests that sodomy is considered sinful, but the Quran's treatment of the practice contrasts with its discussions of zina, sexual relations between a man and a woman who are not married to each other. Zina is explicitly condemned. Nor come nigh to adultery, for it is shameful deed and an evil, opening to the road to other evils. The punishment for it is later spelled out, 100 lashes for each party. The Quran does not offer such direct guidance on what to do about sodomy. Many Islamic scholars analogize the act of zina to determine punishment, and some go so far as to say the two sins are the same. Two other key verses deal with sexual transgression. The first instructs, if any of your women are guilty of lewdness, take the evidence of 4 reliable witnesses from amongst you against them, and if they testify, confine the women to houses until death do claim them or God ordain them some other way. But what is this lewdness? Is it zina or lesbianism? It is hard to say. The second verse is also ambiguous. If 2 men among you are guilty of lewdness, punish them both. If they repent and amend, leave them alone. In Arabic, the masculine dual pronoun can refer to 2 men or to a man and a woman, so again, sodomy or zina. For many centuries, Rosen says, these verses were widely thought to pertain to zina, but since the early 20th century, they have been largely assumed to prescribe homosexual behavior. He and most other scholars in the field believe that at about that time, Middle Eastern attitudes towards homosexuality fundamentally shifted. Though same-sex practices were considered taboo and shameful for the bottom, same-sex desire had long been understood as a natural inclination. For example, Abu Nuwas, a famous 8th century poet from Baghdad, and his literary successors devoted much ink to the charms of attractive boys. At the turn of the century, Islamic society began to express revulsion at the concept of homosexuality, even if it was confined only to lustful thoughts, and this distaste became more profound with the influx of Western media. Many attitudes with regard to sexual morality that are thought to be identical to Islam owe a lot more to Queen Victoria than to the Quran, Rosen told me. People don't know, or they try to keep it under the carpet, that 200 years ago, highly respected religious scholars in the Middle East were writing poems about beautiful boys. Even Muhammad Wahhab, the 18th century religious scholar who founded Wahhabism, seems to draw a distinction between homosexual desires and homosexual acts. According to Natana Delambas, the author of Wahhabi Islam, From Revival and Reform to Global Jihad, 2004. The closest Abdul Wahhab came to touching upon the topic of homosexuality was in a description of an effeminate man who is interested in other men at a wedding banquet. His tone here is tolerant rather than condemnatory. As long as the man controls his urges, no one in the community has the right to police him. Religious scholars have turned to the hadith, the sayings and doings of the Prophet Muhammad, to supplement the Quran's scant teachings about sodomy and decide on a punishment. There are 6 canonical collections of hadith, the earliest recorded 2 centuries after Muhammad's death. The 2 most authoritative collections, Rosen says, don't mention sodomy. In the remaining 4, the most important citation reads, "Those whom you find performing the act of the people of Lot, kill both the active and the passive partner." Though some legal schools reject this hadith as unreliable, most scholars of Hanbalism, the school of legal thought that underpins the official law of the Saudi kingdom, accept it. It may have provided the authority for the execution this February. Judges will go out of their way to avoid finding that an act of sodomy has occurred. However, don't ask, don't tell is the next section. The gay men I interviewed in Jeddah and Riyadh laughed when I asked them if they worried about being executed. Although they do for the Matawa to some degree, they believe the House of Saud isn't interested in a widespread hunt of homosexuals. For one thing, such an effort might expose members of the royal family to awkward scrutiny. If they wanted to arrest all the gay people in Saudi Arabia, Miss Fear, my chat room guide, told me, repeating what he says was a police officer's comment, They'd have to put a fence around the whole country. In addition, the power of the mutawa is limited by the Quran, which frowns upon those who intrude on the privacy of others in order to catch them in sinful acts. The mandate of the Committee on the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice is specifically to regulate behavior in the public realm. What occurs behind closed doors is between a believer and God. This seems to be the way of the kingdom, essentially. Don't ask, don't tell. Private misbehavior is fine as long as public decorum is observed. Cinemas are forbidden, but people watch pirated DVDs. Drinking is illegal, but alcohol flows at parties. Women wrap their bodies and faces in layers of black, but pornography flourishes. Gay men thrive in this atmosphere. We really have a comfortable life, said Zahar, the Saudi who asked me not to write about homosexuality in Islam. The only thing is the outward showing. I can be flamboyant in my house, but not outside. This strikes many Saudis as a reasonable accommodation. Court records in Saudi Arabia are generally closed, but anecdotal evidence suggests that the mutawa are most likely to punish men who are overtly effeminate, those whose public behavior advertises a gayness that others keep private. Filipinos who have little influence and less familiarity with the demands of a double life seem to be especially vulnerable. When I asked Jamie, the Filipino who says he gets followed down the street by Saudi men, whether he was gay, he answered with a high giggle, obviously, but he has paid a price for his flamboyant behavior. He used to wear his thick black hair down to his shoulders, concealing it with a baseball cap in public, until recently, when he ran into a man in a shortened thobe at a coffee shop. The mutawa asked for his work permit. Even though he produced one, Jamie was shoved into an SUV and driven to a police station. Are you gay? A police officer asked after pulling off Jamie's cap and seeing his long hair. Of course not, Jamie says. He challenged the cop to find a violation, and the officer confirmed the mutawa's report that Jamie was wearing makeup, dressing like a woman, and flirting. After spending a night in jail, Jamie was taken to Mutawa's headquarters in Jeddah, and a mutawa interrogated him again. When he tried to defend himself, the mutawa asked him to walk, and Jamie strode across the room in what he considered a manly fashion. He was eventually allowed to call his boss, who secured his release. Jamie cut his hair, not out of fear, he says, but because he didn't want to bother his boss a second time. Jamie laughed as he told me his attempts at dissimulation. Though the stakes can be high, efforts to stand by homosexuality here often do seem farcical. The mutawa get to play the heavies. The government goes through the motions, and the perps play innocent. Me? Gay? Few people in the kingdom, other than the mutawa, seem to take the process seriously. When the mutawa busted the party that led to Marco's deportation, they separated the showgirls wearing drag from the rest of the partygoers, and then asked everyone but the drag queens to line up against the wall for the dawn prayer. At the first of the 3 ensuing trials, Marcos and the 23 other Filipinos who'd been detained were confronted with the evidence from the party: plastic bags full of makeup, shoes, wigs, and pictures of the defendants dressed like women. When the Filipinos were returned to their cells, they began arguing about who had looked the hottest in the photos. And after his punishment and deportation, Marcos was unfazed. When he returned to Jeddah, it was under the same name. The threat of a crackdown always looms. However, in March 2005, the police crashed what they identified as a gay wedding in a rented hall near Jeddah. According to some sources, the gathering was only a birthday party. Similar busts have occurred in Riyadh. Most of the partygoers were reportedly released without having to do jail time, but the arrests rattled the gay community. At the time of my visit, party organizers were sticking to more intimate gatherings and monitoring guest lists closely. And finally, we have the last section, the closeted kingdom. To be gay in Saudi Arabia is to live a contradiction, to have license without rights, and to enjoy broad tolerance without the most minimal acceptance. The closet is not a choice, it is a rule of survival. When I asked Tariq, a 24-year-old in the travel industry, whether his parents suspected he was gay, he responded, "Maybe they felt it, but they have not come up to me and asked me. They don't want to open the door." Stephen Murray, the sociologist, has called this sort of denial the will not to know, a phrase that perfectly captures Saudi society's defiant resolve to look the other way. Acknowledging homosexuality would harden a potentially mutable behavior into an identity that contradicts the teachings of Islam to the extent that Islam deals with the subject. A policy of official denial but tacit acceptance leaves space for change. The possibility that gay men will abandon their sinful ways. Amjad, a gay Palestinian I met in Riyadh, holds out hope that he'll be cured of homosexuality. That when his wife receives her papers to join him in Saudi Arabia, he'll be able to break off his relationship with his boyfriend. "God knows what I have in my heart," he said. "I'm trying to do the best I can, obeying the religion. I'm fasting, I'm praying, I'm giving zakat, charity, all the things that God has asked us to do. If I have the ability, I will do it." Amjad cited a parable about two men living in the same house. The upstairs man was devout and had spent his life praying to God. The downstairs man went to parties, drank, and committed zina. One night, the upstairs man had the urge to try what the downstairs man was doing. At the same moment, the downstairs man decided to see what his neighbor was up to. "They died at the stairs," Amjad said. "The one going down went to hell. The one going up went to heaven." For Amjad to accept a fixed identity as a gay man will be to forego the possibility of ever going upstairs. But as the Western conception of sexual identity has filtered into the kingdom via television and internet, it has begun to blur the Saudi view of sexual behavior as distinct from sexual identity. For example, although Yasser is open to the possibility that he will in time grow attracted to women, he considers himself gay. He said that his countrymen are starting to see homosexual behavior as a marker of identity. "Now that people watch TV all the time, they know what gay people look like and what they do," he explains. "They know if your favorite artist is Madonna and you listen to a lot of music, that means you are gay." The Jeddah-based magazine editor sees a similar trend. The whole issue used to be whether the guy was a top or a bottom, he told me. Now people are getting more into the concept of homosexual and straight. But new recognition of this distinction has not brought with it acceptance of homosexuality. Saudi may be tuning into Oprah, but her tell-all ethic has yet to catch on. Radwan, a Saudi American, came out to his parents only after spending time in the United States, and the experience was so bad that he's gone back into the closet. His father, a Saudi, threatened to kill himself, then decided that he couldn't because suicide is haram, forbidden. Then contemplated killing Radwan instead. In the end, Radwan told me, "I said, I'm not gay anymore, I'm straight." Most of his gay peers chose to remain silent within their families. Yasser said that if his mother ever found out he's gay, she would treat him as if he were sick and take him to psychologists to try to find a cure. Zahar, at 41, has managed the unusual feat of staving off marriage without revealing himself to be gay. Marriage would devastate him, he says, and exposure of his homosexuality would devastate his family. So Zahar has employed an elaborate series of stratagems: a fake girlfriend, a fake engagement to a sympathetic cousin, the breaking off of the engagement. As he put it, "I schemed and I planned. I don't like to calm people, but I had to do that for my family." In the West, we would expect such subterfuge to exact a high psychological cost, but a cost doesn't feel as lonely when so many others, gay and straight, are in it too. A double life is the essence of life in the kingdom. Everyone has to keep private any deviance from official norms. The expectation that Zahar would maintain a public front at odds with his private self is no greater than the expectation facing his straight peers. Dave, the gay American I met, recalled his surprise when his boyfriend of 5 years got married and then asked him to go to newlywed's apartment to make the bed up the way you make it up for the benefit of the bride. Saudis will get stressed about things that wouldn't cause us to blink, Dave says. But having to live a double life, that's just a normal thing. Most of the gay men I interviewed said that gay rights are beside the point. They view the downside of life in Saudi Arabia, having to cut your hair, or hide your jewelry, or even spend time in prison for going to a party as minor aggravations. When I see a gay parade and trips to the West, it's too much of a masquerade for attention, Zahar said. You don't need that. Women's rights, gay rights, why? Get your rights without being too loud. Embracing gay identity, generally viewed in the West as a path to fuller rights, could backfire in Saudi Arabia. The idea of being gay, as opposed to simply acting on sexual urges, may bring with it a deeper sense of shame. When I first came here, people didn't seem to have guilt. They were sort of, I'll worry about that on Judgment Day, Dave said. Now, with the internet and Arabia TV, they have some guilt. The magazine editor in Jeddah says that when he visits his neighbors these days, they look back at their past sexual encounters with other men regretfully, thinking, what the hell were we doing? It's disgusting. When Rawad arrived in Jeddah in 1987 after seeing the gay rights movement in the United States firsthand, he wanted more than the tacit right to quietly do what he chose. Invisibility gives you the cover to be gay, he said. But the bad part of invisibility is it's hard to build a public identity and get people to admit there is such a community and then to give you some rights. He tried to rally the community and encourage basic rights, like the right not to be imprisoned. But the locals took him aside and warned him to keep his mouth shut. They told him, you've got everything a gay person could ever want. And that's the end of the article written by Nate. Now I will talk about this sheet of paper here. It's in Arabic. I didn't spend any time learning Arabic in the last 2 years. Bad girl, bad girl. So I can't begin to tell you what this says, but I did ask one of my students to translate it for me. And something that sticks out that was also present linguistically in this article here was the term normal. Something being normal, the normality of behavior. And according to this is the short hair issue at the university that I mentioned earlier. It says something along the lines of, if you have the abnormal haircut, meaning the boy's haircut, then you have to fill out this information here. I'm sorry, I don't know the details, but basically she's being reported to one of the head of staff at the university. It's funny because I know a couple of things about what it means to sort of cut your hair in society. It could mean you're either enslaved or that you are liberating yourself from some sort of oppression. I guess it could also be a gender identity sort of thing, right? If you're a woman and you want to identify as a man, then for sure you will cut your hair. If you no longer want to be bound by the beauty standard, which is very common and accepted in the society of just having long, unshorn hair, then cutting it is a way to be defiant. And I would say out of every class of 40 or so students, at least 3 of them have the very, very short boy's haircut. Now the teachers were told to go around and collect the names of the students who had this haircut. And one of my students had the haircut. I didn't tell her, come on. She had the haircut. And not only that, she's like well, this is a separate issue. She's horrible attendance and her grades are very poor. So I kind of looked at her that same week when this issue was floating around and the teachers were collecting names, and she kind of like brushed her hair back like she was totally insecure. She knew what was going through my mind. I just let it be. And I would never put anyone through that embarrassment, humiliation. So on the topic of sort of homosexual, same-sex behaviors of an affectionate nature that I've witnessed, I have seen a lot of the young women at the university petting each other, cuddling each other, getting like extremely comfortable with each other, and sometimes it can be perceived as like a guy because one will have the really short haircut and the other one won't because she's playing the female's role. They often hold hands, they kiss a lot, and I don't mean like normal like kissing like, oh, you're my friend, I miss you. I mean like, yeah, it's kind of like borderline like behavior that you might expect to happen behind closed doors. Saudi men, grown men, actually walk through the malls, walk through the streets, sometimes holding hands. They do kiss each other too, in ways that Americans are not used to. But at the same time, after having been here long enough and come to the conclusions that I've come to, for sure, a lot of it is homosexual behavior. I've had a friend here tell me that he has made an appointment to sort of speak to an imam about the culture here and Islam, and the imam, one of the first things he did was make a pass at this man in his apartment. He was really shocked about it. This is going to sound way out there, but just bear with me. I'll try to explain the best I can. When I'm in work mode, I just think about the task that has to be done, what I have to teach. I don't tolerate a lot of nonsense from my students. Every now and then, if you're a teacher of any kind, you know that you have students that test your patience. I had this one student, really poor hygiene, overweight, with immaculate English skills. She would invite me to her house in Dammam, and then one day she said something along the lines of, yeah, come, I will eat you. And of course, being in teacher mode, I told myself, no, that's not what was said. Even if it was said, just ignore it. Keep doing your job. And I did. At another point in time, and I wasn't sure because, again, it was so far from what I'm used to, I couldn't make the connections between what I was hearing and what I was thinking, but one of my students said something along the lines of, what, teacher, it's okay. You do this before you get married, and then when you get married, you go with guys. Basically, talking about more of what I was reading about, as in you have relationships, even sexual, with women before you get married because it's not considered sinful. And if it's not considered sinful, then the implication is that homosexuality is okay pre-marriage, and after marriage, then the heterosexual sex is okay. And that's where the hypocrisy, in my opinion, comes in, because you can be as gay as you want. You can go into hotel rooms with other people as long as they're the same sex as you. You can be there as long as you want, and no one bats an eyelid. But the second you engage in these same behaviors with someone of the opposite sex, people are ready to alert the authorities. It's an amazing concept. I once dressed up in a really beautiful traditional Saudi gown and went to a New Year's party. I stayed here during New Year's. Don't know what I was thinking at the time. I walk out and there are a bunch of South Asian workers huddled together, and it was almost like a few of them within this huddle, within this group, could not control their impulses, because you won't believe this, but a couple of them started kind of grinding their bodies on their friends, co-workers that were in the group, and no one kind of flinched or jerked back. It was almost like maybe they were understanding, or maybe in the past they've engaged in this sort of homosexual behavior with their co-workers, but it just seemed very strange to me. Again, you have these groups of people who also have to forego sex in order to stay employed as a migrant worker in the country. Let's see if I can think of anything else. So that's all for this video on homosexuality in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I do hope that you found this video insightful. I hope that you were able to take something from it, to learn something, and I would be happy to know if you'd like to add anything, any opinions that you have of your own, and you are welcome. You're very welcome to ask questions, and I'll get around to answering them if possible. And that's all. Take care, you guys. Bye.